Nobody was warned about the signal. It was a Friday afternoon in Northern California, and the ground did something that most people in the state slept right through. At a little after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, out in the rugged, thinly populated country north of a small town called Covelo, a seismograph needle that had been tracing a nearly flat line suddenly jumped. Then it jumped again. A cluster of small earthquakes was rippling through the crust, and within a matter of hours, the sequence built to its loudest note yet. A magnitude 4.3 that shook the valley hard enough for people in Covelo to feel their houses move. It was shallow, only about 5 miles down, which is close enough to the surface that the energy arrives sharp and sudden rather than soft and rolling. And here is the first strange thing about it. No warning came. Not a phone alert, not a countdown, nothing. The earthquake announced itself by happening. Now, a magnitude 4.3 is not on its own a disaster. California produces earthquakes that size on a regular basis, and most of them do exactly what this one did, which is rattle some dishes, startle some dogs, and fade back into the background. But what happens when a small, ordinary earthquake strikes a very extraordinary fault? Because that is exactly what happened north of Covelo on that Friday. The fault underneath that swarm is one of the longest, least understood, and quietly most concerning structures in the entire western United States. Almost nobody talks about it. That magnitude 4.3 did not arrive out of nowhere. For roughly the previous 12 hours, that same patch of ground had been restless. Earlier in the afternoon, there had been a magnitude 3.8, and around it a scatter of smaller shocks. The kind of behavior seismologists call a swarm. In a swarm, you get a flurry of comparable-sized events clustered in time and space with no obvious single leader, as if the crust in one small area is being worked loose from several directions at once. And this was not the first time this specific corner of Mendocino County had done this in 2026. Back in the spring, in early May, the ground near Covelo had produced another little cluster. A magnitude 3.5 and a magnitude 3.3 within 12 hours of each other. Most of the time, a swarm is just a flurry that rises, peaks, and dies away, leaving nothing behind. But occasionally, a swarm is the sound of stress migrating through the crust, redistributing itself, probing for a weakness. And when a swarm lights up directly on top of a fault as large and as loaded as the Bartlett Springs Fault, the ambiguity stops being an academic curiosity. The lack of a public warning points directly to the physics of shallow, near-source events. The West Coast Early Warning Network detects the fast, gentle P wave at stations near the epicenter, calculates the magnitude, and broadcasts an alert before the slower, destructive S wave arrives. But if you are sitting almost directly on top of the rupture, as Covelo sits almost directly on top of the northern Bartlett Springs Fault, there is no head start to give. The P wave, the S wave, and the alert all arrive on top of each other. Furthermore, a magnitude 4.3 sits below the automated threshold for widespread public alerts. The silence that greeted the Friday swarm was not a broken network. It was a system running headlong into the hard geometry of a shallow rupture striking right where people live. The earthquake struck at only 5 miles depth. When a rupture occurs tens of miles down, the seismic energy dissipates over distance. A shallow earthquake, however, delivers its energy directly to the surface, sharp and concentrated. The Bartlett Springs Fault Zone performs its seismic business in this shallow domain, meaning any larger event it produces will deliver its shaking with the same undiluted intensity. Inland from the coast, through the folded green mountains of the northern coast ranges, sits Round Valley, a flat oval of grassland ringed by mountains. Covelo sits almost directly on top of the northern reach of a strike-slip structure that runs for roughly 100 miles, or 120 kilometers, the Bartlett Springs Fault Zone. While the San Andreas Fault captures public attention, the Bartlett Springs Fault runs parallel to it farther inland. It is long enough and active enough to produce a magnitude 7.0 to 7.5 earthquake. Yet, throughout California's entire written history, extending back roughly 175 years, the Bartlett Springs Fault has never produced a major rupture in front of human observers. A fault's maximum potential magnitude scales directly with its rupture length. A short fault can only release small events, but a 100-mile structure possesses the physical capacity to tear for tens of miles continuously. Deep underground, below 13 kilometers, tectonic forces load the Bartlett Springs Fault at a rate of 7.5 millimeters per year. Over centuries, that slow tectonic movement accumulates meters of unreleased slip. Deep paleoseismic trenching along the fault reveals that it has ruptured in major, groundbreaking earthquakes at least 3 times in its buried past, with the most recent event occurring between 300 and 1,000 years ago. The complete absence of a major rupture during written history does not indicate safety. It demonstrates that the fault has been continuously accumulating elastic strain without a major release for centuries. The central systemic contradiction lies in its surface behavior. Sections of the fault exhibit surface creep, sliding at approximately 3.5 millimeters per year near Lake Pillsbury due to the presence of slippery serpentine gouge. However, geodetic satellite measurements confirm that this surface sliding disguises at least one locked patch down in the seismogenic zone. The shallow creep does not dissipate the deep strain. It concentrates stress directly onto the edges of the locked section. As small swarms begin to illuminate the northern terminus of this 100-mile system near Covelo, a critical structural question emerges. Is this recent sequence merely benign background noise? Or are we observing the step-by-step stress migration required to unseal a locked, deeply loaded fault that has held its strain for nearly a millennium? To evaluate the true scale of the threat posed by the Bartlett Springs Fault, we must deconstruct its mechanics and examine its place within the broader regional architecture. The fault itself is a right-lateral strike-slip system. If you stand on one side and look across, the opposite block moves to the right over geological time. It is not an isolated structure. It operates as an integral component of the Pacific North American plate boundary, driving parallel to the San Andreas in a shared tectonic direction. Extending 100 miles from Cache Creek and Lake Berryessa in the south, north past Lake Pillsbury, and through Round Valley near Covelo, the pure physical length of this fault sets its structural limit. In earthquake physics, magnitude scales with rupture length. A short fault lacks the surface area to generate a major shock, but a 100-mile structure holds the mechanical capacity to unleash a magnitude 7.0 event, or up to a 7.5 if the entire zone unzips in a single continuous cascade. The energy released by a magnitude 7.5 is exponentially higher than a 7.0, capable of altering landforms and severing critical regional infrastructure. The relative anonymity of the Bartlett Springs Fault is a product of geography rather than physical insignificance. While the San Andreas runs beneath major metropolitan centers, the Bartlett Springs Fault cuts through the steep, sparsely populated terrain of the northern Coast Ranges and the Mendocino National Forest. This remote setting allowed a myth of harmlessness to take root, a superficial assessment reinforced by the peculiar phenomenon of surface creep. Along specific stretches, such as near Lake Pillsbury, satellite and creep meter measurements record the ground sliding continuously at roughly 3.5 millimeters per year. Geologists have identified the internal lubrications responsible for this motion: soft, slippery serpentonite rock ground into fault gouge. Serpentonite acts as a velocity-strengthening material, meaning it resists rapid acceleration and allows the upper crust to slide without generating large seismic waves. Popular interpretations often treat fault creep as a natural safety valve, assuming that continuous sliding bleeds off tectonic strain and prevents catastrophic failure. However, energy budget calculations expose this assumption as a fundamental misinterpretation. Small earthquakes and localized surface creep release only a fraction of the total force applied by plate motion. Thousands of minor events cannot discharge the immense elastic strain stored in a locked structure. In reality, partial creep can make a fault more dangerous. As a serpentonite-rich section slides, it drags against adjacent locked zones, concentrating stress directly along the boundaries where the stuck rock meets the moving rock. Rather than diffusing energy, surface creep actively focuses mechanical stress onto the locked asperities below. Modern geodetic tools, including continuous GPS networks and interferometric synthetic aperture radar, reveal that beneath the sliding surface near Lake Pillsbury lies at least one clamped, locked patch down in the seismogenic zone. Deep below 13 kilometers, where the rock transitions to velocity-weakening friction, the fault is completely stuck, while tectonic forces load it at 7.5 millimeters per year. Paleoseismic trenching confirms that this locked patch has ruptured before, leaving buried scars from at least 3 prehistoric surface-breaking earthquakes. The most recent event occurred between 300 and 1,000 years ago. With California's written history spanning only 175 years, the entire modern era falls within a prolonged period of silence. Over 500 years, an unreleased strain rate of 7.5 millimeters per year accumulates nearly 3.75 meters, roughly 12 feet, of fault slip waiting in the crust. Over 1,000 years, that number exceeds 20 feet. This structural setup shifts our understanding of the recent activity near Covelo. The 2026 sequence is not an isolated event. It occurred on a system carrying centuries of unreleased displacement, directly adjacent to regional neighbors that are also beginning to shift, raising the critical question of how stress is transferring across the entire northern coast ranges. To grasp the full systemic danger of the Bartlett Springs Fault, we must look beyond its isolated structure and examine the regional web of stress transfers across Northern California. The Bartlett Springs Fault is not acting in a vacuum. It sits directly adjacent to another major inland structure, the Maacama Fault Zone. On June 24th, just weeks before the Covelo swarm lit up the northern Bartlett Springs, the Maacama Fault slipped. A magnitude 5.6 earthquake struck near Redwood Valley and Willits, marking the largest seismic event recorded on that specific fault in roughly 75 years. The Maacama event knocked out power to thousands of homes, rattled county buildings in Ukiah, and scattered inventory across local businesses. But its true significance lies in what it signals about the crust. Two of the region's massive inland faults, running parallel to each other, began talking within weeks of one another. In geophysics, when one fault ruptures, it does not simply release local energy, it redistributes physical force throughout the surrounding crust. This phenomenon, known as Coulomb stress transfer, means that a slip on one structure sheds its load onto neighboring systems, loading adjacent locked patches and pushing them closer to their failure thresholds. The Maacama and Bartlett Springs faults are bound together in a shared tectonic engine, absorbing the north-northwestward motion of the Pacific Plate. When the Maacama slipped on June 24th, it altered the stress field across Mendocino County, transferring load directly eastward toward the locked asperities of the Bartlett Springs Fault. The subsequent earthquake swarm near Covelo is the direct physical footprint of a crust actively responding to this redistributed pressure. The human risk associated with these inland faults stems from their immediate proximity to communities along the Highway 101 corridor and inland valleys. While public attention remains fixated on the coastal San Andreas, regional hazard planning demonstrates that inland faults pose a far more intimate threat. Mendocino County's official hazard mitigation planning models the impact of major ruptures across these systems. Although a magnitude 7.8 event on the offshore San Andreas would produce widespread shaking, a magnitude 7.4 rupture on the inland Maacama-Garberville system is projected to inflict over $1 billion in direct economic damage. The reason is pure spatial geometry. The San Andreas lies farther west, offshore or along sparsely populated coastline, whereas the inland structures, the Maacama and the Bartlett Springs, cut straight beneath the towns, transportation lifelines, water systems, and rural valleys where people actually live and work. A smaller, shallow event directly under populated centers delivers far more destructive ground motion than a larger event miles out at sea. If the locked patch of the Bartlett Springs Fault releases its accumulated centuries of strain in a magnitude 7.0 or larger earthquake, the cascading impact on local infrastructure will be immediate. Shallow ruptures generate high-frequency, violent ground acceleration that destabilizes older masonry, snaps rigid power and water connections, and triggers widespread landslides across the steep, unstable slopes of the coast ranges. In remote valleys like Round Valley and towns like Covelo, access roads and utility lines threading through narrow river canyons are highly vulnerable to physical disruption. A major rupture on the Bartlett Springs Fault would isolate these communities within seconds, cutting off power and emergency response long before regional help could navigate blocked mountain passes. The sequence of events from May through July 2026, the early swarms near Covelo, the 75-year record quake on the neighboring Maacama, and the shallow magnitude 4.3 near Round Valley, presents a clear diagnostic of a regional system under profound strain. The 100-mile Bartlett Springs Stranger, loaded by 7.5 millimeters of annual slip for up to 1,000 years and masked by superficial surface creep, is no longer silent. The physical mechanics, historical paleoseismic record, and real-time stress transfers all converge on a single conclusion. The quiet giant of the northern coast ranges is actively rearranging its depths, and the long-held assumption of its harmlessness has reached its structural limit. The fundamental error in evaluating geophysical risk lies in confusing the brevity of human memory with the true operational cycle of planetary systems. California's written record spans roughly 175 years, a mere flicker against the millennia-long cadence of the Bartlett Springs Fault. When a major structure remains quiet across several generations, human society routinely constructs a narrative of stability, mistaking silence for safety. Yet, as the mechanical analysis reveals, the Bartlett Springs Fault has spent this entire historical window continuously absorbing energy. Driven by tectonic plate motion at a deep rate of 7.5 millimeters per year, the system silently loads its subterranean asperities day after day, decade after decade. Over a 500-year window, this constant motion accumulates nearly 12 feet of unreleased slip. Over 1,000 years, that potential displacement exceeds 20 feet. In the physics of fault rupture, stored displacement dictates earthquake magnitude. The 100-mile physical length of the Bartlett Springs Fault Zone provides the raw spatial scale required to unleash a magnitude 7.0 to 7.5 catastrophic earthquake. When that accumulated strain finally overcomes the static friction of the locked patch, it will not be released through gentle, manageable increments. It will manifest as a sudden, violent failure, unzipping tens of miles of crust in seconds. The presence of surface creep has further obscured this reality. The discovery of soft, serpentine-rich fault gouge sliding at 3.5 millimeters per year near Lake Pillsbury created a comforting illusion of a natural safety valve. But energy budget mechanics dismantle this superficial interpretation. Surface creep is not a broad-spectrum stress reliever. It is a localized phenomenon governed by velocity-strengthening material in the upper crust. Deep below, where velocity-weakening rock dominates, the fault remains clamped shut. Far from protecting the region, surface sliding actively transfers and concentrates stress onto the edges of these locked asperities, sharpening the mechanical gradient right at the boundary where the next major rupture will originate. This localized stress concentration is now intersecting with regional dynamics. The June 24th magnitude 5.6 earthquake on the adjacent Maacama Fault demonstrates that the broader northern Coast Range's crust is undergoing active stress redistribution. Through Coulomb stress transfer, the slip along the Maacama shed its load eastward, increasing the mechanical tension on the neighboring Bartlett Springs system. The subsequent earthquake swarms near Covelo, shallow events striking just 5 miles down without early warning, are the physical evidence of this transferred strain working through the crust. When a shallow rupture occurs directly beneath rural communities, early warning networks cannot bridge the spatial gap. The P waves and S waves arrive simultaneously at ground zero, delivering undiluted, high-acceleration shaking directly to roads, power grids, and homes. For places like Round Valley and Covelo, embedded in steep mountain terrain, the cascading effects mean immediate physical isolation as landslides sever narrow canyon passes. The Bartlett Springs Fault is not a harmless stranger, nor is it a secondary player in California's tectonic architecture. It is a fully loaded 100-mile engine, masked by surface creep, primed by centuries of accumulated displacement, and now responding to regional stress transfers. The recent swarms near Covelo are not random noise. They are the diagnostic indicators of a complex, interconnected system approaching its structural limit. The geological record written in the soil shows that this fault has torn the ground open before and will do so again. Science has provided the tools to detect its faint subterranean twitches. The remaining question is whether we possess the clarity to recognize the warning before the silent giant fully wakes. The true complexity of the Bartlett Springs Fault Zone emerges when we synthesize its microscale physics, macroscale tectonic drivers, and regional structural interconnections. For over a century, public awareness and regional planning in California have fixated on the San Andreas Fault, a high-profile, highly visible coastal boundary. This hyperfocus created a profound institutional blind spot regarding the inland structures of the northern Coast Ranges. The Bartlett Springs Fault, running 100 miles through rugged terrain, was largely treated as a secondary feature. Yet, when evaluated through the cold logic of physical law and energy budgets, the Bartlett Springs Fault represents a fully capable, highly dangerous geophysical hazard that operates on its own uncompromising clock. The fundamental misconception surrounding the fault stems from its dual physical nature. The observation of surface creep, measuring approximately 3.5 millimeters per year near Lake Pillsbury, led to the popular assumption that the system harmlessly bleeds off strain. This superficial interpretation collapses under rigorous physical scrutiny. The surface sliding is driven by the presence of weak, serpentine-rich fault gouge, a velocity-strengthening material that slips smoothly near the surface. However, satellite geodesy and regional deformation models confirm that this upper crustal glide is merely a surface layer. At depths below 13 kilometers, down in the seismogenic zone where large earthquakes originate, the rock transitions to velocity-weakening friction. Here, the fault contains at least one locked patch, an asperity clamped tight by immense lithostatic pressure. While the surface slides, the deep locked asperity holds fast against a deep loading rate of 7.5 millimeters per year, driven by the relentless movement of the Pacific and North American plates. Rather than relieving stress, the creeping surface sections drag against the edges of this locked patch, concentrating strain right along its margins. Paleoseismic trenching proves that this locked patch has ruptured in major, surface-breaking earthquakes at least 3 times in its buried past, with the most recent major event occurring between 300 and 1,000 years ago. With California's written history capturing less than 2 centuries, the entire modern era of human habitation has unfolded during an extended, deceptive period of seismic quiet. Over centuries of complete structural lock, unreleased tectonic displacement accumulates exponentially. At 7.5 millimeters per year, 500 years of quiet equates to nearly 12 feet of unreleased slip. 1,000 years yields over 20 feet of stored displacement. When a 100-mile fault releases this magnitude of stored energy, it does so in a major earthquake ranging from magnitude 7.0 to 7.5. The recent sequence of events, the early swarms near Covelo, the June 24 magnitude 5.6 earthquake on the parallel Maacama fault, and the subsequent shallow magnitude 4.3 near Round Valley, signals a regional system actively undergoing stress transfer and redistribution. The ultimate limit of human infrastructure in the face of such geophysical realities is defined by spatial proximity. Because the Bartlett Springs Fault sits directly beneath the inland valleys and mountain passes of Mendocino County, a major rupture delivers high-frequency, undiluted shaking straight to ground zero without early warning. The physics of shallow ruptures dictate that P waves and S waves arrive simultaneously at the surface, rendering automated alert networks physically useless for those living directly on the fault. Landslides triggered across steep mountain passes will instantly isolate remote rural communities, severing utility grids, water networks, and transport corridors long before external aid can respond. The science does not predict the exact day or hour of the final rupture, but it defines the hard physical